Ja verujem u vašu energiju, ja verujem u vaš rad, u vaš trud. Ja verujem u Srbiju, ja verujem u svakog srpskog čovjeka i znam da možemo da budemo bolji od drugih. Pokazali smo to prethodne 3 godine i to možemo i moramo da nastavimo.
Hello, welcome to Alpha Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. We're recording this on Thursday, the 25th of June. My name is Alex Hokele, I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Alpha Bunga Bunga is also George Hoare and Philip Cunliffe in the UK, and this episode's been produced by Philip Cunliffe. Today we're talking about the Western Balkans, and we'll find out where that is in a moment. This is a little geography lesson. More specifically, we're talking about the very recent Serbian elections. Quite controversial.
Yep. And very excited to be talking to Lily Lynch. So Lily's an American who's been living in Serbia and the region for a while now. And she's a major international commentator on the politics of Serbia and the politics of the region more generally. So I'm very interested to hear what she has to say, particularly in the wake of the very specific characteristics of Serbian politics, which nonetheless, I think, provide plenty of insight into wider political dynamics throughout the world, refracted into a very kind of particular Balkan prism.
Yeah, George, you've never been to the Balkans. You told us you haven't been to Slovakia either, which was just a little bit of extra information.
Just testimony to the kind of geographically limited knowledge. This is typical, though, with you Brexiters, George, with your parochialism and your lack of attention, your fascist, soggy, grey island mentality, where you don't look beyond the borders of your own country and you just think it's all the same.
I'm just working my way through Europe, west to east. So yeah, I haven't been other than to Russia and Estonia and Latvia.
Lest the listener think we're complete ingenues in this regard. Phil, you have lots of Balkan connections, don't you? So you have some credibility to speak on what's going on in southeastern Europe. Yeah,
well, I have family there. My mum's Serbian, and I have spent a lot of time there, both as a child and less so, I guess, as an adult. And I write regularly about Western Balkan politics, wherever the hell the Western Balkans are. So yeah, I mean, I've got some, I have some insights, I suppose. And also, obviously, it would be remiss of me not to say that the experience of the disintegration of Yugoslavia and its descent into civil war over the course of the 1990s was obviously very profoundly impactful for me and shaping my political outlook. So I'm very curious to see what Lily has to say about the most recent shenanigans in Serbian politics.
So just to check that the Serbians are the bad guys, right? So you're both a pro-Serb and pro-British Brexiter guy, just to paint a picture of quite how evil you are.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, there'll be even more fodder now after having been a Nazbol, a Strasserite, a Brexit fascist. I can now be a Serbian genocidaire. Maybe there you go. Excellent. Twitter. Thank you. Yeah. Right there.
Well, it's a global politics podcast, but it's not necessarily the goodies of global politics. Maybe we're just assembling all the baddies. So, yeah.
Thanks, George.
Oh, I guess I'm also included in that.
All right, that's enough from us. We should get Lily on the line. Let's call her up.
So today we're talking to the editor of Balkanist magazine, Lily Lynch, about the recent general election in Serbia and politics in the Western Balkans more generally. Thanks for joining us and welcome to the show, Lily.
Thank you so much for having me.
So before we get into the detail, I just want to establish for our listeners where the Western Balkans are, because it's something that seems to me it's an abiding source of geographic, political, geopolitical, historical, mythical, cultural confusion. Because, if we say West Balkans, it suggests the western end of the Balkan Peninsula in Europe. Yet no one speaks about the east end of the Balkan Peninsula, which would presumably be Romania and Bulgaria. I guess Western is generally associated with better things than Eastern. On the other hand, Romania and Bulgaria are both members of the European Union. Nobody talks about the South Balkans, which I guess would be Greece and maybe Turkey. The origin of the word Balkan is, which means forested mountain. It's a Turkish word, in fact. A country, and Turkey obviously then shades into the Middle East. So it's just, where are the Western Balkans? Can you help us out, Lily? Where are they?
Well, the Western Balkans, that kind of designation is an European Union designation, and that kind of describes the countries of, for the most part, of the former Yugoslavia. The successor states, the former Yugoslavia. So I suppose that's what we'll be talking for the most part today. I think today we're going to be talking mostly about Serbia, Kosovo, maybe a little bit of Montenegro, perhaps Macedonia. But yeah, so I think that you've said before that you don't like this designation, Western Balkans, and I was curious as to why you don't like it.
Yeah, I suppose because it seems to me it's an attempt to kind of detoxify the idea of being Balkan. So you add West to it to make it, because West is best, right? So you add West to it to make it sound better. But like I say, then it becomes this weird kind of new cultural construct because there's no East Balkans. Nobody ever says the East Balkans or the South Balkans or the North Balkans. I mean, where's the North Balkans? Is that Austria? Is that like Bavaria? I mean,
Vienna.
Yeah, exactly. Vienna, right? So it's always, all these attempts to kind of reclassify the Balkans in ways that make it more palatable always end up reproducing all of these kinds of conceptual absurdities that go along with it. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, I see what you mean. And I always was kind of averse to it because I thought it was something that was conceptualized by the European Union to describe a cluster of countries that would be one day in the EU. So that's kind of my impression when you say Western Balkans. It's the countries that are not in the EU yet, but are candidate countries. Yeah. I wouldn't even include Croatia or Slovenia. They're already in the EU. So I would say that ex-Yugoslavia plus Albania, minus Croatia and Slovenia, are the Western Balkans.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, I mean, it was very much a kind of a calculated construct by the European Union to kind of capture this clutch of small states that were left over from previous waves of expansion, surrounded more or less on all sides by European Union member states, and that for all sorts of reasons were seen as sources of kind of instability of various kinds. But it's that thing, nobody wants to be in the Balkans. If that's the West Balkans, where are the proper Balkans,
Exactly, yes. And you see this word Balkan still has really a negative charge. I've used the word balkanization a few times here in the region. I don't know if you've ever come across this, but people become very kind of offended because they see it as a pejorative, that if you apply the word balkanization to something that doesn't have anything to do with the region, the Balkans, they become, it's offensive. So and I can understand why.
You should maybe try out Belgianization, just as a kind of softer alternative or something.
Right. Yeah, that works.
So Balkan is in the title of the magazine that you edit. And could you maybe tell us a little bit about how you ended up editing Balkanist, and indeed, how did you end up in Belgrade to begin with?
Well, I ended up in Belgrade. It preceded the magazine. I was here and I was curious about the region before I started grad school in London, came here and met a guy and moved here, and we co-founded Balkanist together. We started it, and I have been the editor-in-chief from the beginning. We just felt that there was, at the time, it would have been 2013, that there was a space that wasn't being filled, like for a certain kind of writing about the region. We felt that the region was kind of written about in a very dry and uninteresting and unengaging kind of way, and that it was always like a very morose, always backwards looking kind of, and we wanted to kind of inject something a little bit fresher into what was out there, and I just wanted to experiment. I just wanted to write and have fun, really, with what I was, living here, and so we kind of started it. We also really did not like the way other media had portrayed the Balkans for at least a couple of decades, since the 90s, and we wanted to kind of poke holes in that and make fun of it. And so that was sort of the original idea. And then, of course, all your creations become like Frankenstein and like acquire their own. And that's sort of what happened. So that's kind of the origin story of Balkanist, and that's how I ended up in Belgrade. And I've lived in other capitals in the region. I lived in Zagreb, I lived in Sarajevo, I lived in Tirana, I lived in Ukraine, in Odessa, lived in Budapest. So I've been all around. Lived in Skopje for some time. So I have a pretty decent grasp on kind of what's going on to varying degrees in different countries, but Serbia is certainly the kind of like home base I have in the region.
Okay, and just before we talk a bit more about Serbia, could you maybe characterize that problematic coverage that you were seeking to challenge when you established the magazine?
Ooh.
I know it's a big ask, but just to give our listeners something of the flavor of what you felt you were up against.
I suppose that there's the kind of, there's, on the one hand, there's this whole kind of Balkanist orientalist discourse that's Maria Todorova has written about in her famous book about the Balkans, portraying the region as this kind of like orientalist fantasy, you can imagine like, gentlemen explorers from the 19th century going around the Ottoman Empire and lounging in harems and like smoking opium, and they kind of see this region. They've always kind of seen this region as exotic but dangerous. That exists, but then also I think that more what we were pushing back against was something more recent, and that was just the kind of exclusive 90s portrayal of the region. The only kind of interest people seem to have in the region is as a warning and as a source of kind of misery, and we wanted to tell different kinds of stories about it. And of course, we ended up getting into the misery. You can't ignore that. It's real. It happened. Yeah. But we certainly felt that also. We felt that there were the same stories being told over and over again, and that's something that still happens. And we felt, especially coming from Belgrade, that we had kind of different perspective, but that we still wanted to include people from across the region, but that there were other stories that hadn't been given as much attention, and other kinds of voices, whether it be young journalists or young people who'd never been published before, who had something to say, who normally wouldn't have a platform, or, people who normally wouldn't, say the academics who wouldn't publish more kind of like journalistic or analysis like in a shorter form. So we kind of wanted to bring together, people who wouldn't ordinarily be writing for like a magazine, and bring in perspectives that you wouldn't necessarily hear everywhere else. I don't know if we were always successful in that, but that was certainly we had hoped to do that in the beginning.
Yeah. So on the question of Serbia specifically, at the core of the Western Balkans and the capital, Belgrade, obviously capital of the old Yugoslav state, they just had a general election. And since as you indicated, since the end of the wars of Yugoslav secession, Serbia doesn't make the international news so much. The recent exception to this was when the Serbian president, Aleksandar Vučić, whose Progressive Party just won the election, a few months back, at the start of the corona pandemic, he declared that European solidarity was a myth, and that the only way Serbia could withstand the corona pandemic was by relying on their friend and brother, in Vučić's word, by whom he meant the Chinese premier Xi Jinping. And so this statement was taken as an indication of the growing shift in power to the east in global politics. So, this was one way in which Serbia was prominent in the news. Could you tell us a little bit about what you think is interesting about Serbian politics and merits wider attention?
I think Serbia has one of the most interesting foreign policy programs in the world, of any country in the world, and certainly in Europe. This kind of non-aligned policy that has been inherited in a way that it's inherited from Yugoslavia, from socialist Yugoslavia. Belgrade, of course, was the capital of the non-aligned movement, but still that's a foreign policy that Belgrade pursues to this day. And that was evident in that speech that Vučić gave, where he was praising Brat Xi, Brother Xi, as he's known here. So Serbia is certainly, I don't know if it's always been exclusively the talent of the foreign ministry, but it sometimes Serbia has gotten kind of lucky in the last couple of years with the kind of geopolitics shifting and the world shifting. But it has kind of successfully managed to strengthen ties with major powers, from China, Russia, Turkey. It still is an EU candidate. Washington, I think you could probably say with certainty, and we'll talk about this later, that Serbia's relationship with Washington is stronger now than it's been at any other time since, since, I don't know, when certainly since Milosevic, since Tito, probably.
Yeah.
So really, Serbia's foreign policy is fascinating. I mean, you can watch the news and see in the morning, Vučić meeting with officials from the EU, and then in the afternoon he's praising socialism with Chinese characteristics on Chinese television. So it's really kind of a fascinating place to be. You kind of feel like you're at the center of the universe in some ways, And of course, and I don't want to discredit this, the foreign ministry especially has embarked on this effort to strengthen ties with what we would call the so-called third world, and which Tito obviously cultivated strong ties with countries in Africa and Asia, and then those ties remain strong today. And many of those countries do not recognize Kosovo's independence. We'll talk more about Kosovo later, I guess, but that's Serbia's former province that Serbia does not recognize as independent. So Serbia really has a fascinating kind of foreign policy. It's also tends to be kind of an interesting bellwether in some ways, I think, for the world. I mean, there's a famous quote Julian Assange said, of all people, but he said it in 2013, that the future comes to Serbia first.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, it's a good quote. So, I mean, I think that's one of the kind of more astute things that he had to say. But it does feel that way sometimes. I mean, it certainly felt that way with this, with what's going on, but watching what's happening in America, and the kind of like right now, watching from Belgrade, there is this kind of sense of, I think, almost Schadenfreude here among people who are saying, like, look, we've seen this before,
That's really funny. I mean, sorry, Lily, this is Alex here. I mean, we on this podcast obviously like to talk about Italy being the country of the future. You know, that the future comes to Italy first, and in some ways, it's sort of the premise of this podcast. Certainly, our logo, anyway. So it's actually interesting to hear that Serbia might might trump us on that. I actually wanted to ask a different question, if this isn't too big a one, but excuse my ignorance. I'm actually fascinated to learn, as you've just said, that there's a certain continuity between Yugoslav foreign policy, and specifically its kind of central role in the non-aligned movement, and a continuity to today in terms of its ability and perhaps kind of institutionalized skill in playing off other great powers against one another. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about that historical development? Because I find that fascinating, and how that institutional continuity has been maintained despite a complete rupture between Yugoslavia and then Serbia.
I would say that this government, these parties that have been in power since 2012, the Serbian Progressive Party, and then in coalition with the Socialist Party of Serbia, that was Milosevic's party, but it was the Socialist Party is kind of the watered down League of Communists of Yugoslavia. So it's the kind of the ideological inheritor of socialist Yugoslavia, you could say, of the party. And I would say under this government, that's one thing that they deserve some degree of praise for, that they've kind of resurrected this Tito-style non-aligned foreign policy. I think they've really, Foreign Minister Ivica Dačić, he's even kind of in his style of diplomacy, he kind of mimics Tito in a way. He throws these lavish parties, he sings songs, he learns. So he, sorry, this is just, I'm kind of just like observing his style. I've seen him sing songs for people in different languages. So he'll learn, if he's singing to the French, to Macron, he'll learn like French song, and he'll sing the French song, or and so every diplomat or head of state that comes, he learns a song and sings, and throws huge parties with cigars and drinks, and so it's this very Tito style kind of bon vivant, kind of like enjoying life, socialist kind of cigar socialism style. That's the stylistic part. I think that part of the other side of it is that it's just it's in Serbia's best interest to. I think they've realized that there's a global, that as we all have, that the world is changing, that China is ascendant, and they have gotten on board with that, but without burning bridges with Washington, while playing Washington quite well, I think.
Sorry, George here. Sorry, just to cut you off there a little bit, just to maybe broaden it out a little bit. Can you, and you might have been going on to say this anyway, but could you tell us a little bit more about Vučić's pivot to China? How significant is geopolitical rivalry in the Balkans, West or otherwise?
I mean, that's a good question. I think that we're all still kind of waiting to see. Of course, after that speech that he gave on March 16th, when he declared the state of emergency for the coronavirus, and he said that European solidarity is a fairy tale, and said that China, our Chinese brothers are kind of our only hope. That the EU the reaction from Brussels was very knee-jerk negative, and they were saying, masks off, this is the real Serbia. What I think people need to know is that, on the one hand, yes, people are very thankful towards China and Serbia for the assistance given during the coronavirus epidemic, but that was also, Vučić was also campaigning then. So there was an election coming up. So part of that speech, that kind of anti-Western sentiment plays very well to his base, and his base is most of the country, or to Serbs in general. But anti-Western sentiment kind of plays very well. So I think that it has to also be understood within the context of the elections. So I don't necessarily think that. Okay, on the one hand, China is very present here, and that's very real. I mean, there are just within the last, I think, few weeks, Huawei cameras, facial recognition cameras, have been installed all over Belgrade. They're everywhere. There's a map that tracks. I was taking photos of several of them. They're you can see them on almost every corner. So that is very real. I mean, China and Serbia are cooperating in that way. That does not necessarily mean that Serbia is going to be like joining like the Eurasian Union, and it's no longer going to be just talking with DC or with Brussels. I mean, Serbia has been very clear about, even though Vučić said that European solidarity is a fairy tale, that within a few days he was meeting with like the EU delegation and continues to do so. So he part of that speech, which I thought was actually good for Europeans to hear because they were lagging in their assistance to Serbia. Part of that was a kind of a populist campaigning for the election. I don't know. Yeah.
No, thanks. Really interesting stuff. Yeah.
You're making me nostalgic. Talking about cigar socialism now. I was supposed to go a few weeks back, in fact, to Serbia, but obviously it was cut off by the corona pandemic. Yeah. But cigar socialism, that's a great phrase. I'm going to remember that one.
I wrote an article about it for Balkanist when Castro died. About Tito and Castro's cigar socialism, and that anyway. But yeah,
we'll add that. Yeah. We'll add that one to the show notes for sure.
Okay.
So you mentioned Vučić and his ability to kind of maintain this foreign policy of non-alignment. And he is one of the most interesting political leaders today, I think, in many ways. And it's a shame, in a sense, that Serbia is a small country, so that he perhaps doesn't get the attention that he would otherwise get, because I think he's a fascinating and sinister figure in so many ways. So he begins as this kind of vicious and violent ultranationalist during the wars of the 1990s. And now he's a technocratic centrist who's showered with praise by EU leaders. And in the run-up to the vote on Sunday, he was praised by Donald Tusk in a socially distanced kind of video call, where he was, talked about as to all the changes and transformations, how he's brought Serbia closer to the European Union. And then he also won the attentions of the world press when he appointed lesbian Ana Brnabić as the country's first female prime minister. So how do you read this this political chameleon?
I mean, first of all, I just want to say that I totally agree with you. That he is probably one of the most fascinating world leaders. I don't know if you can call him a world leader because, as you said, Serbia is such a small country. But I think, he is absolutely fascinating. Not just his kind of political transformation and whitewashing to a certain extent with the aid of the West, I think. About his 90s past as Milosevic's Minister of Information, or some would say propaganda. But he's an expert at playing to the fears of major powers. And so what he's done is that he'll appoint a lesbian prime minister. How many years after probably the worst anti-gay riots in Europe in 2010, the Gay Pride Parade 2010. 4 years later, Pride Parade started being held without a single incident, and then in 2017, got a lesbian prime minister. I mean, what he does for Washington and for Brussels is he is able to point to people like war criminals like Vojislav Šešelj, who are in politics in Serbia, and who unfortunately still, and he is able to say, look, if you don't stick with me, then we're going to go back to the 90s. We're going to go back to this horrible period of time when you had, look at all these right-wing parties that are like vying for, political support. And then in Serbia, he can say, but I'm the conservative, stable hand, and I'm not like these liberals who want to sell you out to NATO. So I mean, he's really he's actually the lesbian prime minister. It's a really fascinating thing to me, because it's a if you think about it in like the American context, the way that we're talking about, sorry to kind of this is a bit of a tangent, but like I've been just talking about this recently. When Biden and the people around him talking about how they need a woman of color to be a VP, this seems like something that a lot of people support. Like, this is great. But in Serbia, when it's done, when this very, let's say, patriarchal country, very traditional country that has history of homophobic violence very, very recently, puts a lesbian prime minister in power, it's exclusively pinkwashing, right? We see the cynicism of it. We see how tokenistic it is and how fake it is. But we're not able to we're not able to see it the same way in America. And I have a friend who was giving an interview to, I think, a journalist from Germany after one of the Pride parades in the last year or two. And he kind of exploded at her. She said, she asked, what has the lesbian prime minister done for the LGBT community in Serbia? And he said something like, well, what did Barack Obama do for blacks in America?
That's a good response. Yeah.
Yeah. Excuse me for that. It was a little bit all over the place, but I mean, there's so much to say about Vučić. I mean, yeah.
Sorry, just to interject there. I guess in terms of the election, what's the basis of Vučić's appeal in your view? He's got quite a broad base of support, right? But could you describe for us what you might take to be a quote unquote typical supporter of his?
Sure. Excuse me. They won the election with, I believe, I think it was 62% of the vote. That's a pretty significant victory. His party, the voters for Vučić tend to be older. They tend to be pensioners. They tend to receive their information from newspapers and television and not the internet. So I would say younger people make up more of his critics. But what's important about the way that power is distributed here, is this is a tremendous number of people in this country are employed directly or indirectly by the party. It's deeply like the party has its tentacles in the private sector and in the public sector. So this is many people are reliant on paychecks, or on their paychecks are reliant on kind of servility to the party. And you have to understand, and this is something that I've come to realize with time. It's the kind of social pressure that puts on people. It's not just your job that's on the line. Imagine if you have a friend whose job is, or a family member, parent or something, whose job is connected some way to their to the party, whether it's in journalism or in the public sector somewhere. Then that's a lot of pressure, like to not go against, to not vote against their interests if you care about them. And it's understandable why people wouldn't, I mean, to me, to a certain extent, why people would at least keep their head down. And if not, just outright vote for Vučić. And also because the opposition is in tatters and does not offer a particularly appealing alternative.
So the opposition boycotted the election, right? So could you maybe tell us a little bit about that? What happened, and did the boycotters gain anything politically from this?
So yeah, there's the opposition in Serbia is complicated, but there is an alliance of opposition parties that are very ideologically diverse that boycotted the elections. They organized a boycott, and they've also been boycotting parliament since late 2018, early 2019, and they had been the group that had been organizing these mass protests. You might have heard about those protests. They were going on last year. But they were this Alliance for Serbia they were polling at about, I think, just under 10% before the boycott.
Right.
They opted not to participate. There were a lot of criticisms of that strategically because the elections that happened over the weekend were both for local elections and parliamentary elections. And so, for example, I have some friends who voted in the local elections but boycotted the parliamentary elections. But from what I know is what they did gain through that boycott is some kind of credibility for the 2024. They might be able to build something in the interim. But certainly, I mean, out of this election, this is, of all the elections I've been here since 2000. I've seen elections here since 2012, and have kind of been here on and off for different elections. And this is by far the most dramatic when it comes to the dominance of like one political group. You have no opposition in parliament. There's no opposition. So the ruling party, like I said, received 62%. The Socialist Party of Serbia, who was in, I know this is a little bit too granular maybe for the audience, but just to kind of illustrate, there are only 3 parties in parliament, and they were all previously together in coalition. So there are no opposition parties at all.
Yeah, so Lily, I mean, I wanted to ask about this because, I mean, just not knowing very much about Serbia, but, reading about the election that they reduced the threshold for entry for parties from 5% to 3%. And so that let in more parties, but that seems to indicate that there's a bunch of very, very small parties. I mean, small, in terms of their actual political support, so that there's no unified opposition. So, I mean, I wanted to maybe hear your comment on that, but also to know a little bit more, I guess, sociologically, where the lines of division are between Vučić's group and the opposition. And obviously we know that turnout was low, probably under 50% because of the boycott. But I saw that, in Belgrade, it was like 35% or something. So, I mean, is there a sort of urban-rural divide that's going on there? I mean, why was turnout much lower in Belgrade? Is that a particular stronghold of the opposition, or how does that work out?
You're absolutely right. There is an urban-rural divide, and I think that it's kind of under-examined. People talk about all other kinds of divisions in the region, like ethnic divisions, generational, but they don't talk about this urban-rural divide, which exists in all countries of former Yugoslavia, and certainly exists in Serbia. You even have like specific neighborhoods in Belgrade that are, very that tend to like be completely different than vote very against Vučić and for kind of more like, say, like socially liberal, pro-EU parties. So yeah, it's very different, but the main takeaway from this election, it's just I don't think there isn't a parliament like this in Europe anywhere else where you don't have an opposition. You have the only so-called opposition you have are minority parties because they don't have the same threshold, 3% threshold to get into parliament that constitutionally they are because they're minority parties, they're permitted to enter. I think there are like 15 seats that are allocated for minorities. But even the minority parties, including the Albanian minority parties, were in coalition with the Serbian Progressive Party, with Vučić's party before. So there's literally no opposition in parliament.
I mean, that's I think brings to mind, especially I think for someone who doesn't know, Serbia or know the region necessarily very well, but you would think of someone like Viktor Orban in Hungary in terms of his domination and Fidesz's domination of Hungarian politics. So I mean, maybe that leads me on to ask for a bit of a comparison. I mean, for those who don't know Vučić, we've had a little bit about what he's like, but how does he compare politically to other sort of populist, strong men, whether it be Viktor Orban or Putin or Đukanović in Montenegro, some of these sorts of characters, how does he compare?
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Especially, sorry, just to tack on something, I think also precisely because, as you and Phil were discussing earlier, Vučić seems to be fated as a bit of a kind of technocrat centrist type, whereas those other ones are very much not. So what distinguishes him?
Well, first of all, I think that it's important to say that despite all of the attention that Hungary gets, they have opposition in parliament. There are opposition parties in parliament in Hungary, and also in Montenegro, even though it's the situation there is pretty miserable. I think that Vučić, how does he compare to these other types? What's unique about Serbia, and I was just talking about this, or I was talking about this with Branko Milanović, the economist, when he was here last. Is the party has no ideology. Vučić has no ideology. He brands himself as this kind of like technocratic centrist, like you said, or center right, let's say. But in reality, he kind of has does no defining, like, he shapeshifts. He's still a chameleon. I mean, we talked about his kind of evolution politically from being Milosevic's or being a minister of propaganda and a radical in his youth, but he also shapeshifts depending on who he is with today. So there is that's one of the strange kind of things about living in Serbia, is you're living in a very what is, I think at this point we know, pretty like an authoritarian under an authoritarian regime. I think that's not in question anymore. But it has no ideological, like, there's no ideology attached to it. It's not, Orban, we can say, is right wing and has a very specific sort of, his ideology is fairly clear. Even maybe people can say that it's cynical and that he's using it to kind of protect his inner circle of cronies or whatever. But I think that the difference between Vučić and Putin and Erdogan and maybe even Đukanović, because Đukanović in Montenegro, even though he's been in power for 30 years, his entire kind of, political persona is being pro-West, pro-NATO, and being able to pivot at the exact right moment needs to change. So he's the to get out of jail free card, like almost literally for him, and that's why he's been allowed to rule for 30 years.
That's always useful, to be friendly and oriented to the West. That way, you keep on the West's good side, and you can get away with whatever you want.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it is. Yeah, yes.
I wanted to talk a bit about EU expansion, how it works out in Serbia. So Serbia is a candidate state for membership of the European Union. Some former Yugoslav states, as we already mentioned, are members of the European Union now, Slovenia and Croatia. All of the former Yugoslav countries want to become members of the European Union, in a great kind of historical irony, given how much blood was spilled to erect borders between them. They want to be absorbed into a new kind of borderless union. But I wanted to, I suppose, think about how how the politics of EU expansion works. How does the European Union function in Serbian politics? How do people approach it and think about it? Because I think it's of interest to our listeners to understand the European Union from a different perspective from the one which we normally talk about on this show.
That's great. And it's really fascinating to talk about this with people in the UK, where I was living at the beginning of this year, because people, when I was speaking with Remainers, they were talking about how fantastic the EU project is, and if you talk to people out here, you'll see a completely different kind of you'll hear many more mixed things. On the one hand, the EU, to be fair, many people see their future in the EU, especially young people, and there's a tremendous amount of immigration from all countries of former Yugoslavia to say Western Europe and EU countries, and I think a lot of people, and especially a lot of young people, see their future there, and that's why visa liberalization is kind of the issue for countries like, well, specifically for Kosovo. Right now, Serbs can travel to the EU, but the general, I'm speaking that obviously there are many different kinds of, there are many views. I don't want to speak on behalf of the entire nation of Serbia, but there is a little bit of, there's lingering resentment towards EU countries because they're viewed part of the alliance that bombed them in 1999. So the EU is kind of viewed as the NATO and the EU are sort of lumped together in the minds of a lot of people here because they're made up, are a lot of countries in common, and so there is still some lingering resentment. The EU is obviously more popular than NATO. Like more people in Serbia would want to join the EU than join NATO. NATO membership is very unpopular. But I think, and I don't know if you've seen this, but the EU is involved in this very big kind of PR push where they're trying to. There's a lot of there are misconceptions in Serbia. There are polls that have been done where Serbs believe that the bulk of, say, aid in the country comes from China or comes from Russia. And the EU tries to kind of does these spend a lot of money on trying to kind of educate the population and say, no, actually, we spend more money on this region or on specifically in Serbia than China or Russia. It's just your perception of who is giving the money is wrong. But this kind of cold and clinical kind of approach doesn't really seem to be working very well. When I was talking to a friend who'd actually been working on a report for the EU, and he was saying that that Serbs weren't very moved by seeing these numbers, like that this is how much money the EU is giving you, because in their mind they were recalculating and they were thinking like, well, how much money or how badly was our infrastructure damaged? How many, during the NATO bombing, like how much do these countries kind of owe us really? Like if you, so, but, and again, it's a mixed thing. I think that there's still the kind of support for European integration or expansion. I'm glad to use the word expansion because we know it's a bit of an imperial project. That it's kind of holding steady. Like, it hasn't really gone down or gone up too much since like the late aughts. For like the last 10 years or so, it's been pretty much constant at around 50% supporting EU integration, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less, depends on the year. I think it went down a bit after Brexit. But yeah, so that's kind of the view here.
So one of the things that you've touched on quite consistently in your writing is the influence of Western NGOs and their involvement in the politics of the region. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Oh, yeah. Well, this is obviously a sector that is demonized in the same way that you would see this sector demonized in say, like Hungary, because they're often backed by, say, foreign money. I do think that this kind of NGOification of society has had some kind of negative consequences. Not negative consequences, that's the wrong way to put it. I think what I meant to say is that that they have suspicioned themselves for reasons that aren't entirely unwarranted. Like they're demonized, but it's not entirely. I understand why. They're seen as attempts to kind of undermine other forms of, say, solidarity and tradition in the country. So whether it's the family or socialist kind of bonds that existed in Yugoslavia, they're there to exact kind of like neoliberal policies and like individualist kind of like rights-based claims on the population, and they're also kind of there to, as a way for, say, Western powers, especially the United States, to kind of identify political collaborators. So, for example, the Prime Minister of Serbia, lesbian Prime Minister, she was working for USAID prior to being Prime Minister, and she was the U.S. Embassy was very much a proponent of her premiership here. So
I don't know if you're able to name any names of these. Is it mainly American larger NGOs? What are the sort of character of these organisations, to give us, I guess, an example or a bit of sort of colour here?
Names. I mean, I think that a lot of they're usually dealing with minority rights, which is the ones that I can think of off the top of my head. All like LGBT rights, Roma rights, and of course, like a lot of them do fantastic work and like really important work for groups that are marginalized. But the problem is, what ends up happening is that they end up employing like say local urban educated young people for the duration of a project, and then those young people learn how to write projects, learn how to get grants, but then after that, say the project ends after a year, where do they go? And it also means that the state is not taking care of those rights. So, for example, ideally, like if you care about the rights of Roma children, or that would be something that that Serbian state would be taking care of.
Instead of organising, exactly. I think that's a fairly common story to a certain extent. Instead of organising politically, it promotes kind of grant and civil society based solutions through kind of trying to always get another project off the ground and again.
Yes, and it's very precarious, and I'm not sure how transferable are for young people who've like kind of grown up there's a whole generation here now. I think like millennials, or people like kind of like cusp, Gen X, millennial cusp, people, like they kind of grew up on grants, so yeah, and it's unfortunate. And also it's great for they do. Again, I don't want to diminish the good work that a lot of them do, and certainly but there are valid criticisms of them as well. And I think another criticism that is valid is that they do not seem particularly interested in the rest of the country. It seems to be like kind of concentrated in urban areas, among like fairly, upper middle class youth, who are, happy to be earning maybe 3 to 4 times what the average person here would earn. There's not a lot of presence outside of the capitals or maybe a few other large cities, and it breeds resentment, elite resentment, that actually feeds back into why someone like Vučić is so popular. So these are obviously scapegoats in media, these NGOs, Western NGOs, and that's unfortunate and sad. And of course, I have many friends who work in that sector, but at the same time, they're not always there is a kind of a cloud of elitism around them, that is exploited again by the pro-government media.
You can see how the two sides of that story fit together.
Yeah.
I wanted to get your view on, it kind of builds on this issue of the role of the middle class, the intelligentsia, the educated elites, because I wanted to get your perspective on something which came to me from an article by Srđan Garčević. He wrote for his blog, The Nutshell Times, about the changing character of the Balkan intelligentsia. And he says that we see some of the legacy of the old Yugoslavia in some of the leading lights of the Balkan intelligentsia today. And he mentions Branko Milanović, the leading economist and specialist on global inequality, who you mentioned just now. But he also mentions Marina Abramović, the famous conceptual artist who's in America now, and of course the big Z himself, Slavoj Žižek. And Garčević says that, such figures could only emerge in a particular circumstances of a country such as Yugoslavia that was perched between East and West in the Cold War and was willing to assert its political and moral independence of the great powers. And he contrasts this with the kind of deference and cringe which is exhibited by Balkan intellectuals and leaders to Western liberalism today. So I was wondering if you could riff off that, maybe to tell us a little bit about the intellectual scene in Belgrade and the wider Balkan region.
Ooh, yeah, that's a good question. I thought that Srđan's article was great. I find the intellectual scene today a bit lacking. I feel that in Serbia, at least, I'm probably. Others would object to that, but I think that, as I said before, many of the most talented young people are looking to leave, and that's been a trend that's been kind of that you've seen increasing with every year. We're very lucky to have people like Srđan in Belgrade, I think. I think that I don't know. All I can say is I have personal anecdotes, which are that the smartest and kind of most talented kind of artists, intellectuals that I've gotten to know since I came here, say 8-9 years ago, are mostly gone. Are living in Milan or London, Berlin and New York, and
indeed, I mean, that's true of the figures I mentioned as well. Milanović, Abramović, and Žižek are all, they're all expats. Yeah, they're all abroad.
Yes, yeah. I think that one development is that, which is very fascinating, and I don't think many people discuss it, is that the ruling party of Serbia, which is obviously not a particularly not a party you would imagine is stacked with intellectuals or artists or anything, has been actually very skilled at co-opting artists and playwrights, and I mean it was after all the Prime Minister of Serbia, the Ana Brnabić, who brought Marina Abramović here for the first time in a very long time. She had a show last year. They've managed to kind of co-opt public intellectuals by giving theater space or art, gallery space, and neutralize them that way.
No, that's interesting. I mean, something that kind of maybe follows on from this is a question. I mean, is there nostalgia for the old Yugoslavia, sort of Yugo nostalgia, in the same way that you might have in Germany, a sort of nostalgia, both amongst Serbians, but also maybe even amongst the Westerners who live in the region, who kind of look back nostalgically?
That exists. Yeah, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of Yugo nostalgia. I think that there was a map published recently about which countries in former Yugoslavia have hold the highest or the most Yugo nostalgia. I think Serbia is at the top. Serbia and Bosnia are always kind of neck and neck for that. Serbia is I think if you ask most, not all people, but if you ask most people which country they prefer to live in, they would say Yugoslavia. There is a bit of a pushback now from, I would say, the Zoomers, who kind of make fun of what they call Yugoboomers, who kind of this kind of dreamy idea about the red passport, where you could travel to Trieste and you could travel all over the world, and you could let's say that you could you made €2,000 a month, and Tito was having sex with Sophia Loren, and everything was very cool.
It's
and
okay, Yugo
there's a
boomer.
little bit of now making people make fun of it a little bit now, but still but certainly that Yugo nostalgia exists, and I think the ruling party and Vučić have kind of have used that to kind of great benefit domestically, to kind of for their average voter, which I mentioned before, are kind of pensioners who are the Yugoboomers, let's say, and they do these big parades that Tito hadn't done since not Tito. This is after Tito's death, that hadn't been held in Belgrade since 1984. These huge parades of tanks and various armored vehicles that are held every year now, that never happened until the ruling party came to power. I think part of it is kind of for the domestic audience, showing now again we're on the world map.
That's interesting. I mean, I can see that how that would play out. Phil.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wanted to finish by picking up on the most recent piece of news to emerge from the region. So that a deal. It appeared like a deal was on the table, not on the table, but at least being constructed by the Trump administration. It was trying to broker a deal between Serbia and Kosovo. Kosovo, having declared independence from Serbia in 2008, ethnic Albanian majority, but Serbia still holds Kosovo to be a renegade province. So it seemed like we were on the brink of the Trump administration being able to broker a deal that would be a foreign policy victory in an election year for a president who's, kind of has been, I suppose, cultivating a particular foreign policy in distinction to previous presidents, previous administrations. And just as the Serbian President Vučić was about to meet with his Kosovo counterparts, the Kosovo leaders have been invited for war crimes, stemming from the guerrilla war that they led in the 1990s. So, how do you read this remarkable kind of coincidence of events?
Yes, this is what's developing. There are many interpretations of what's going on, but my read on it is that, well, just to back up a little bit, this case against Hashim Taci, the current president of Kosovo, who was a leader of the KLA, the guerrilla fighters you mentioned, fighting against Serbian forces in 98, 99. Apparently this case was submitted to the Kosovo Special Chambers in The Hague in April. So the timing of this, of the publication of the indictment, which was just yesterday, is very interesting, and there's no way that it doesn't have something to do with this planned summit in Washington, organized by the Balkan peace envoy Richard Grenell. The speculations are that there is a tremendous amount of tension between Washington and certain European states right now, and the EU in general, but there is Macron just last week announced that he wanted to hold his own, or he announced that he was scheduling his own summit, Kosovo-Serbia summit, for July 17th in Paris. So there is, and the EU had criticized strongly Grenell and the Trump administration's kind of maneuvers to take kind of more muscular approach and take a leadership approach in with negotiations between Serbia and Kosovo. So the thinking goes that that this indictment was publicized just in advance of the this Saturday's planned meeting, to basically make it, to undermine them, and that's been successful. Now they're canceled. And so the question, so what this kind of reveals is this growing chasm between Washington and Brussels, but also individual EU member states, and a desire for ownership over who gets to solve the Kosovo issue.
And I guess it plays into geopolitical rivalry in an unexpected way. It's not just the West v. China and Russia, but also internal divisions within the West themselves, like you say, between who gets to solve the Kosovo issue, who gets to claim the credit for it, is itself an object of contention. Interesting stuff. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Lily. That's been fabulous, and I think will be really appreciated by our listeners, getting insights from Belgrade and from the Western Balkans itself on what's happening there. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, and it is Western Balkans then, Phil, is it? So now you're on board with Western Balkans? Okay.
From the Balkans.
This river here is the official geographical limit between Balkan and Middle Europa. So beware, on the other side, horror, Oriental despotism, women get beaten, get raped and like it. On this side, Europe, civilization, women get beaten and raped but don't like it. So, Balkan, Middle Europa, don't forget it.